Welcome to session 4, Men versus Women on Sex and Childbearing. Hi, Mako.
How's it going, Haley?
It's going good.
Good. Controversial topic today. Not that the others have not been controversial.
Just a little bit.
Just a little.
Just a little bit controversial. So we're talking about men and women. And a concept that we're keeping in mind today is empire. Men have, in a lot of ways, reduced women to commodities for sex and childbearing. And the underlying issue here is control. An empire comes into play here when we think about that an empire could be even a small family empire. And when I think about this, I think about what I call 23andMe mania. There's a lot of people who get real excited to do their genetics, and they just discover some interesting fact about themselves. They're, 2% this, or did you know I'm 5% that? And it doesn't always end so well for some people. It can be more complicated and less enjoyable.
Folks of color understand that that's a sobering thing to look back, right? Because there are, especially in the US, like historical dynamics between men and women over sex and childbearing that are shaped by our plantation history and our plantation capitalist dynamics. The Virginia colony, which, as you will recall from last time, was a company, defined being white as being purely European, and black was defined as having any amount of African descent, right? And then there were other designations for Native American, and so freedom was also defined by the mother's status, whether she was free or enslaved, and that led to some vicious dynamics.
Right. So that means that if you're a white man, back when Virginia was a company, the Virginia colony, they're not legally responsible for sexual crimes. If you're a slaveholder, you own the body of females who were enslaved by you. So you could do whatever you want.
Kind of started a pattern of white male sexual entitlement, right? And we can see some of those attitudes we're going to talk about, like how does this get passed down? But this was one of the ways in which the ruling English developed a racial coalition with other poor people of European descent to form a racial identification and not a socioeconomic identification with poor Black people. Because they shared interests on freedom and getting paid more and all these things. The Virginia Slave Code made women alone responsible for fetuses and infants and their well-being or death. And so basically any white man was legally free to rape any woman of color so long as he did not interfere with another white man's property rights.
Property rights.
Yeah.
Property rights. That's how we looked at it.
That's how we looked at it. And there's a phrase, children of the plantation, that was brought kind of back into public attention by Alex Haley's book, Queen, The Story of an American Family. It was made into a movie, and all of these, children of the plantation were sired. Well, we definitely have to talk about probably the most horrific aspect of American slavery. It was the rape of Black women repeatedly, and often slave breeding, where Black women were raped and forced to bear children and nurse them and then give them up at some point. One of the more tame stories comes from a woman named Harriet Jacobs, an African-American woman who became an abolitionist after she was freed. She wrote a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And then she describes what it was like to be owned by North Carolina plantation owner, Dr. James Norcom. In order to avoid being raped by him, Harriet Jacobs describes having a sexual relationship with a neighboring white man, and she had 2 children with him. And then she hid in a small enclosed space from Dr. Norcom for 7 years to avoid him, his verbal harassment, his sexual harassment, and threats of rape, and so on. It's just terrifying. And that's just one of the tamer stories. So let's back up and try to understand how widespread this was. In 1808, the US Congress banned the importation of new slaves from Africa. There's some debate about why. In 1807, the British passed a law against slave trading in the British Empire, and then they enforced it with their navy. So it's possible that the young United States feared British interference with shipping. It's also very likely that plantation slave owners like Thomas Jefferson wanted to profit not just from tobacco as a crop, but from slaves as a commodity. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." So a woman was regarded as like a bank that gives you a really high interest rate, or a stock whose value doubles every 2 years. And that is Thomas Jefferson. That's one of the reasons why scholars think it was the Upper South that was in favor of banning importation of newly enslaved people back in 1808. They knew they can make a lot more money. Even if that was not their first consistent intention, profit they did. Virginia and Maryland quickly shifted economically. Their biggest export became not tobacco or cotton, but slaves themselves to the Deep South, especially received at the port of New Orleans. So again, let's get a sense of the numbers. In 1810, there was a nationwide census taken. At that point, there were 1.3 million Black people. 1.19 million were enslaved. A little less than 200,000 were free. But in 1860, there were between 4 to 4.4 million enslaved Black people and about 500,000 free Black people. Thinking about those numbers is really sobering, because all of the growth of the slave population, which was 400%, was done by ordinary sexual reproduction. Now, what were the conditions? Some of the children born to enslaved people were born to parents who loved each other, who wanted good things for their children, who thought they could stay together if they could persuade their plantation owners to keep them together. And many did that. But it was definitely true that white plantation owners forced Black women to be raped, to bear children. Listen to this quote from Mary Jenkins Schwartz from her book, Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine in the Antebellum South. Jefferson's home state of Virginia was the leading producer of slaves. Slavery eventually exceeded tobacco as their leading export. Maryland was second. Economist Richard Such did a study which found that in 1860, on farms that had at least one female slave, the ratio of women to men was 2 to 1. In Virginia, female slaves exceeded males by over 300,000. They were used to breed. Robert Lumpkin ran what is mostly referred to as a slave jail, with little recognition that he ran the nation's largest breeding farm. He personally had 5 children with a slave named Mary. Many films have depicted boats arriving in New Orleans, which became the largest slave market in the antebellum South. Rarely is it shown. Those ships originated in Richmond and Baltimore. Slaves were also shipped by railroad, packed in boxcars, were sent by stagecoach. The slave breeding farms are mostly left out of the history books. Many of the white slave owners felt they were doing their female slaves a favor when they mated with them, granting them a respite from the quote-unquote brutish Black slaves they would otherwise be subjected to. Generally speaking, it was the house slaves that got raped the most. We're generally aware that that situation, which we've been led to believe was the worst case scenario, but nobody talks about the 13-year-old girl on a breeding farm forced to bear as many children as possible, only to have them ripped away and sent down south to endure a lifetime of hardship without a mother. It's awful. What's even worse is that these Black women were experimented on by quote-unquote gynecologists. According to historian Deirdre Cooper Owens in her book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, 19th century gynecologists performed experimental C-sections, ovariotomies, and obstetric fistula repairs, primarily on poor and powerless women. These gynecologists learned their trade by performing surgeries on Black women without giving them anesthesia. They thought, or they justified it to themselves by saying, well, they're slaves, or their pain tolerance was really high, so the psychological and emotional and relational and physical suffering of Black women was just unimaginable. Meanwhile, I mean, white women, the union of white women and Black or brown men was stigmatized because freedom was passed down through the mother. And so a biracial free person it became a political challenge. So white men and eventually white society was very, very paranoid about any union between a free white woman and a man of color, because then it became hard to like glance at someone and know who they were and what social standing they had.
So mixed race people pose quite a challenge to the existence of the society that Virginia, the
Right.
colony wanted to create.
Right. Which explains when last time when you mentioned lynching, why it was that many lynchings, not all of them, but many did, were of Black men who just said something friendly to a white woman. I mean, every white society in the South jumped into action and said, we can't have that.
There's a great quote in this book called Hooded Americanism, and you can think about what that hood might be, by David Chalmers. And the quote reads as this: white womanhood not only stood at the core of his, white man's, sense of property and chivalry, she represented the heart of his culture. By the fact that she was not accessible to the Negro, she marked the ultimate line of difference between white and Black. It was impossible to assault either the Southern woman or the South without having implicitly levied carnal attacks on the other.
And that speaks to the idea that white women's purity and sexuality was considered the property of white men. Right? Like they had to be the custodians and guardians of that.
And I've even lived this out in days, within my lifespan. I didn't live back in slave times, and I'm not even an American who was born here, but there have been several times, especially when I was younger, when I would just be out in public, just hanging out, standing in the checkout line, and some lady says to me, tries to ask me where I'm from because they can't figure out what I am, and then they ask a bunch of awkward questions, and they ask, well, what about your husband? I say, oh, he's just a white guy. And they go, oh, honey, but think of your children.
Wow.
And
what do they mean by that?
And I asked them what they mean by that. And then they say, well, you don't want to bring a mixed race baby into the world. And I say, well, I already am. I'm right here. So what do you say about me? And they're like, oh, I wouldn't. And then they get awkward and turn around and stop talking to me. But that's the vestige of these dynamics today.
Right. Well, another dynamic you've told me about is being mistaken for the babysitter. Right? Like
the nanny,
because you're darker than your kids. And so that assumption comes also from plantation times,
yes,
right?
It does.
Where Black women had more proximity to white families because they even nursed white babies or took care of the kid. They were invited into the home, which was different than work in the field, but they still paid this tremendous physical, psychological price for the proximity, and often they were raped. So that trope goes back a really long time.
Yes, it does.
Can we talk about the Bible? Because
yeah.
the Bible has a lot to say about these kinds of dynamics. One of the really interesting stories is the story of Hagar. Right? She was the servant of Abraham and Sarah. And there's really good discussion about like how much agency and willingness did she have in becoming a surrogate mother. But the story goes like she was essentially used by Sarah and Abraham, although, the biblical story seems to attribute more agency to Sarah being her idea.
So we see these power plays going on between men and women and within the factions of women themselves.
There's a lot that we could say about this, but I think that it's really important for us to understand that the story of Genesis actually condemns Sarah and Abraham for doing this, like for abusing her in that way. And we can tell that because Abraham and Sarah were called by God to become kind of an Adam and Eve version 3.0. Like God brought them into a new garden land. And the challenge to them was, despite the fact that you're old, postmenopausal, and biologically not able to have kids. God can bring life out of death. And so there's layers of meaning of bringing life out of death in their story. And they were called by God to bring life out of death biologically, because in a story or in a narrative sense, they're bringing life out of death by coming back into a garden land and becoming another Adam and Eve. And so how would that Adam and Eve, how were they supposed to have a kid? Naturally, and without a surrogate mother? Because Sarah and Abraham don't do that, this is an instance of how they were wrong. This was not what they were supposed to do. It has implications for how we're not to view women as simply bearers of children, and what the people of God were supposed to do to protect marriage, including contentment, including trust. And that's, kind of on the way to Jesus, where having children was really important. Now in the New Testament, it doesn't have the same significance because Jesus has already come. So it's important to see, like, God was already reversing plantation dynamics in his chosen people. And I think that was important for the way you were explaining how empire could be expressed on the big level, but also on the small level, like even in the family.
And it brings up the idea of responsibility. Who's responsible when it comes to sex and childbirth? So women are responsible for contraception, abortion, birth control. And we can see this in the numbers. The cost of birth control, it's an $8 billion industry, and 90% of that $8 billion is spent by women, including 30% of condom purchases.
That really does speak to how much more expensive it is to be a woman
Mm-hmm.
than a man.
Mm-hmm. Women care so much about having children, when to have children, the responsibility that they will pay 90% of $8 billion to manage that. Women care. And so we say, Gabrielle Blair, who has had some great viral posts and wrote a book recently, she says, and I quote, "We put the burden of pregnancy prevention on the person who is fertile for 24 hours a month, instead of on the person who is fertile for 24 hours a day, every day of their life. Men's lifelong continual fertility is a central driving force behind all unwanted pregnancies." And further, we have an entire pregnancy prevention industry built around this brief, elusive period of monthly female fertility, and nothing even close to the equivalent that addresses the persistent male fertility. We are laser focused on the wrong thing, end quote.
The idea of, was it mandatory vasectomies for like when males become adolescents, and like, it can be reversed. I know there's some risks, but that would take care of all or most of these issues. And yet it is so politically impossible to talk about that. But it just goes to show how much men want to control the bodies of women rather than have something done that is frankly minor surgery on themselves.
Indeed. We've been talking about tobacco as our original plantation example, something that we know is not good, and no one is going to argue that tobacco is a great thing for you, but it's still there and it still persists today. And one of the things that we find to be an analog for tobacco when it comes to men and women and sex and childbearing is the concept of incels, people who call themselves involuntary celibates.
And are we saying that this is one of the ways that plantation dynamics kind of continue today? Like, because incels believe they have a right to sex.
And some of the factors here is that they see themselves as victims of a form of discrimination called lookism. They think that they're abhorrent to society and they can't get female companionship. And then they reinforce a hierarchy that exists with men who are ostensibly more attractive than them. And they perform what researchers call a weaponized subordination, wherein they use their perceived marginalization as a manipulation tool, a sort of a scarcity mindset. There's only a few women and only a few men can get them, and I'll never get them.
Are they saying no one swipes right on me? Is that what why it's lookism?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it means. So in these communities, these incel communities, there's a really strong sexism that pervades in these communities, and they perceive their masculinity as two different types of the researchers go into. There's hegemonic masculinity, that's sort of a stereotypical masculinity. You can think of Thor, or some sort of, muscle bound guy who looks really good and ostensibly gets all the women. And then there's a subordinate masculinity that consists of, quote, stigmatized masculine practices that are often explicitly denigrated, mocked, and socially sanctioned. And so the research supports the conclusion that men, quote, uphold systems of oppression to both participate in and justify their hatred of all women, end quote. And
That
so this,
men do this.
yes, men do this.
Support a hierarchy of men.
Yes, yes. And this hostile sexism, which is a denigration of women that comes from the hierarchy of men that they make for themselves, it views women as subhuman. So the researchers describe in this that at the top of what incels perceive as chads, these good-looking white guys, underneath them are African American men who can get all the women, and then it goes down the hierarchy through white men, and sort of brown men are at the bottom of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so women are beneath all of them. Then it's white women. And then all the way at the bottom are women of color.
Mm.
And so it views women as subhuman in a hostile way. And then there's a benevolent sexism that sees women as sort of complementary weaklings who need men's protection. What they note in the research is that women of all colors are viewed in an instrumental way. They are to be used. So women of color are seen as interchangeable, consumable commodities, whereas white women are viewed as the property of dominant white men, and they call them Stacys and Beckys. They have a whole dictionary of terms that they use to talk about women in these very objectifying, instrumental ways where they are sort of cattle. They're there to be used and consumed. Absolutely has a plantation dynamic to it.
Part of the reason the civil rights movement was launched from within the Black church was because so many Black women were raped. We'll put up some of those books and studies and stories here and also below. But I think there's a couple different directions in which this goes, which is really disturbing. I recently read a UN global study that across 80 countries, 25% of people, both men and women, believe that it's okay for husbands to beat their wives. So there's violence that gets used to defend a certain kind of order, like let's keep women in order, and that order could have racial, ethnic components to it. And then there's the view that women are a sexual commodity.
And incels come into this with their entitlement to sexual encounters that they believe they should have, to the point that they, not that anyone is getting elected and making bills to be signed for this, but proposing a form of sexual Marxism wherein the government forcibly assigns women to men to solve that problem for them.
That's amazing that people are able to talk that way in public. I mean, I think, of course, most people wouldn't go to that extreme.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've seen in the last, I don't know, 6 years or so, there are people who advocate repealing the 19th Amendment, repealing women's suffrage, because then women would be more dependent on men. As an example, there was a recent book by Nancy Pearcey. Her book is called The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And one of the things that she says is, in short, women's suffrage represent, like the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, represented a tragic erosion of women's trust in men to take responsibility for the common good, especially women's good. Now, who is Nancy Pearcey? She teaches at Houston Christian University as a professor and scholar, and The Economist calls her, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. I don't know who that reflects more on. Is it The Economist? Is it white American evangelicalism? It is a sad comment. I've heard of people in Christian circles who say women should not be taught financial literacy because her her father should take care of it before she gets married. And then when she is married, then her husband should take care of it. And what that means is that she's really vulnerable to being trafficked, to being lied to being manipulated and abused financially.
Indeed.
So-
And even in softer ways, not just being, frankly trafficked, but
Right.
that doesn't jive with law. I have a credit score. I can take out a loan. I could buy a car or a house. If I do that, and I go out and buy a Ferrari and run up debt, well, that goes on my husband's credit report as well. And he could do that to me. It just doesn't jive with how life works.
Well, thankfully, those kind of changes have happened in recent decades, but in the 1970s, you wouldn't have been able to buy a house.
Right. Recently.
Yeah. Or even your income as a married woman wouldn't have counted towards you and your husband being able to buy a house.
Right.
Until I think it was 1974. We'll talk about that when we get into housing as an issue under plantation capitalism.
Right.
Unfortunately, when we look deeper into this whole dynamic, we see how many Christians have believed lies about what the Bible says about men and women with respect to sex and childbearing. So I want to illustrate that by actually comparing it to how Jewish tradition has thought of it. There was this Supreme Court case in the state of Israel called Cohen versus the state of Israel, where, and I think this was in 1981, where the basic situation, there was a husband and wife who were estranged from each other. They would eventually get a divorce, but before they did, the husband entered the house and raped his wife. After the fact, she took him to court. This went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the state of Israel, and the justice there said a number of really startling, amazing, and intriguing things. And he said, for instance, that he was relieved and gratified that he did not have to look at England or the United States as models for how to handle this, because marital rape did not even exist as a legal category. Like, it wasn't a thing in England or the United States at the time. And it took a few more years really for attitudes to change about this. But essentially, he said, Judge Belchior is his name. He said, I am glad that the tradition of the Jewish community from time immemorial has recognized that marital rape is a problem, and it is a legal category, and it's a sin. So that is huge. I did some more digging into that, and it really comes out of three places in Scripture: Genesis 1, Exodus 21, and Deuteronomy 24, where a woman is made in the image of God just as much as a man, number one. In Exodus 21, a woman has conjugal rights, and a man doesn't, or the husband doesn't. And then in Deuteronomy 24, there's stuff about like a new husband needs to stay home and learn how to please his wife. So there's basically Jewish tradition has decided, like, look, it's pretty intuitive. Men do not need to be assigned conjugal rights, like the right to sexual pleasure, but a wife does, because especially in ancient times, all the way until now, probably the most vulnerable position that a woman could allow herself to be put into is to be married, right? It's to be married. So Jewish law aims at the protection of wives. I'll list some resources for this to see this, but it is incredible. In the Jewish tradition, according to Scripture, wives have conjugal rights, the right to sexual fulfillment from their husbands, but husbands do not have the reciprocal right from their wives. That is amazing.
That is a mic drop moment. And I think it stands in such stark contrast to what we have coming out of evangelicalism, what has come out of evangelicalism. I have a text here by Wayne Mack, and he's talking about, he says here, refusal to submit to the husband is rebellion against God himself. Submission to the husband is a test of her love for God, as well as a test of love for her husband. The wife then must look upon her submission to her husband as an act of obedience to Christ and not merely to her husband. And then he goes on and on and on. And he says, he quotes favorably here Bill Gothard's definition of submission of all people,
Oh, yeah.
and says that submission is the freedom to be creative under divinely appointed authority. No mention of the wife's conjugal rights, no mention of the vulnerability that women put themselves in marriage, merely just a reiteration of how submissive women must be and how glorious it would be if only she were even more submissive.
That's just taking plantation capitalism and plantation sexuality and cramming it into the Christian world as if you could do things like that. And
exactly.
That is, I mean, it testifies to the separation between church and synagogue as well, which is its own problem. But and I know what people are going to say. They're going to look at 1 Corinthians 7, don't deny each other, and therefore husbands have equal rights. But no, that's for the purpose of prayerfulness and fasting and special things that are related to the Christian vision of self-discipline and celibacy. Like that was actually, and mission. So it was for those purposes, but not taking away a wife's right to conjugal fulfillment or making a husband's right to that equivalent and on the same level. It is not doing that. So
well, let's link that back to the incels then as well too, right?
Yeah.
If the incels are saying, I have a right to have a woman assign me one so I can have my rights as a man, which is purely sexual fulfillment, then we are saying that in case law from Israel, from time immemorial, that is not the case. Women and women alone have the right to conjugal fulfillment in sex, in marriage. Men don't have that. It's going to happen, but men don't have that right that God has laid down, because God is concerned about the rights and the well-being of the vulnerable more than those who are in power. God turns a plantation upside down.
Absolutely. So that really attests to how, not only how far our culture has gone away from God's original vision for relationship, but also the amazing work that especially Christian men put in to do mental gymnastics so that we can make scripture mean something that it did not mean.
Right.
That is crazy. And it is the view. I mean, basically the sources you quoted are saying that marital rape should not be a crime, should not be a sin, but it is. And they want to go back to legally the days in the US or in the UK where when a woman says yes at the altar, she's saying yes to every other time, where it doesn't really matter if husband and wife become estranged. It doesn't matter if she doesn't want to get pregnant again, but he doesn't care. It doesn't matter if he picked up a sexually transmitted disease. Like there's all of these reasons for why marital rape needs to be a hard line boundary, recognized in the church and in society. And yet this is one of those places where Christians are working overtime, unfortunately, to argue that it should not.
Right.
Shouldn't count.
Right.
That's crazy.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, so we'll leave the rest for next time. Join us for the continuation of session 4, Men versus Women on Sex and Childbearing.